Now let's understand data trigger concept. So now just like we tried to do property trigger, so there is a basic difference between these two. Normally property triggers are triggered, or changes with respect to property trigger are triggered through something which is called as dependency properties only. When it comes to data triggers, any normal .NET property can very well trigger the change because of data trigger. So ultimately I am being dependent on what is something called as some X property of some control. So EasePress property of some control called as button. What I'm trying to set up is font size of something called as button in case of property trigger. So ultimately I'm talking from the perspective of controls properties, which are more or less dependency properties. When it comes to something called as, that is where we use trigger. When it comes to data trigger, you can very well do binding with respect to some sort of external data sources, and then external data source will trigger the property change, and then that you can very well bind it with dependency properties. So let's try to understand it here. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to add a kind of a scenario, that is I'm going to have a button here which is by default going to be disabled, and then there will be a checkbox which will specify accept the conditions. If you accept the condition, then only the button is going to get enabled. So for that purpose, what we will try is, I'm going to add a button here. Let's name it as btn proceed. Then we'll have height here as usual, width 200, and by default I'm going to put a content here, that is proceed. By default this button is going to be disabled, but then we will add it later on. Now this particular button that we have, after this we will also have a checkbox. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add checkbox before button. So a checkbox here we will have. Checkbox will have a name as in check condition. Then we will have height here. Rather, we don't need height and width because it's just going to have normal content, which is called as I accept conditions. Then by default it is going to be checked false. So it's not going to be checked checkbox at all. So initially when you run this project, what you will see is checkbox is unchecked and button is disabled. But I did not put here button disabled. So I want button to be enabled only on a checkbox checked, kind of you can say trigger. So how do we manage this? The very first thing is I'm going to specify this button will have some style by default. Then that particular style, as it's going to go and target somebody called as button only, the default style that I'm looking for is I want this button's property called as is enabled should be set to false. So I'm going to put here a value just going to be false. So what will happen now if I run it? You will see button is going to be disabled first, and then checkbox will be there. But if I check this checkbox, nothing is going to go and happen with respect to button. So now what I'm going to do is I need to convey and couple the checkbox and the button together. So somebody should keep on checking whether checkbox is checked or not, and then accordingly somebody should set up this is enabled property for button. So what is it that we can do now? Here after the setup, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put up here style triggers. Then so far we use property trigger. First time I'm going to use data trigger, and I'm going to specify in this triggers that my trigger to change this is enabled equal to false is going to be dependent on somebody called as element called as checkbox condition, and then its property which is called as is checked. Then I'm looking for a specific value over here which is going to be, so maybe after this I'm going to look for specific value here which is going to be true. So if for a control called as check condition, if is checked is set to true, then based on that trigger what I would like to do is I would like to use a setter and set current buttons property called as is enabled equal to true is what we will specify, and we'll close it. So now if I run this, now you will notice that checkbox is the button is disabled and checkbox is unchecked. If I check this, the button gets enabled. If I uncheck this, the button gets disabled. So you will notice without writing a single line of code in C#, we achieved this. Now this kind of a binding syntax that we have used it before. We did bind with respect to some control, some path earlier. But here, instead of using this element to element binding, what one can very well do is, we can very well look for some sort of database or data source specific property. So it can be a normal .NET property as well when we are going to bind it with. However, the target property that we are targeting to, for example, enabling the button also. So the targeting will always be a dependency property. So ultimately, we are the target is always going to be dependency property, in the sense, since almost every control, the properties which we change very often, the properties which we read very often, or the properties for that matter which are very vital, which read, and I would say read only. So you will notice those properties are mostly dependency properties. We already have gone through this kind of a discussion. So a quick discussion or quick point to note here: property trigger ultimately gets triggered whenever there's a change in some sort of dependency property. Ultimately, it's a coupling between dependency properties. Whenever data trigger is there, data trigger can be coupled with some sort of normal property of .NET data source as well. But then here, the property that it is going to trigger the change to, that property is going to be a dependency property. So hopefully the point is clear, and the important fact to understand here is, without writing a single line of code in code behind or C#, we have achieved these kind of things in the UI. So now the next part which remains is event trigger. Though we have understood this event trigger concept using animation demo, what I'm going to do is a simple change is using some transformation we will try to achieve with the help of event trigger.